Solomon, like Paul and so many other people, recognize that we'll never find real contentment outside of God. And so today we're going to look at both Solomon and Paul as they talk about contentment. We're going to read from Ecclesiastes, and we're going to come to some passages, some parts of a passage in Philippians 4 where Paul talks about contentment as well. A wealthy businessman was horrified to see a fisherman sitting outside his boat playing with a small child. He said, "Why aren't you out fishing?" That's what he asked him. And the man said, "Because I caught enough fish for one day." And the man said, "Well, why don't you catch some more?" "What would I do with them?" He said. "You could earn more money." He said. "What would I do with that?" He said, "Then with the extra money, you could buy a bigger boat, go into deeper waters, catch more fish. You'd make enough money to buy nylon nets. You could catch even more fish and make more money. With that money, you could own 2 boats, maybe 3 boats. Eventually, you'd have a whole fleet of boats and be rich like me." And the fisherman says, "Then what would you do?" Then said the businessman, "You could really enjoy life." The fisherman looked at the businessman, kind of confused, and said, "What do you think I'm doing right now?" He was enjoying life, and it didn't have anything to do with the stuff. Everyone is looking for happiness. Everyone is looking for contentment. Money, wealth, and happiness are not necessarily linked. If they were, there would be no miserable rich people, and there would be no happy, joyful, poor people. Solomon and Paul both found that contentment doesn't lie where most people believe it does. Here's what Solomon says. "If you see oppression of the poor and perversion of justice and righteousness in the province, don't be astonished at the situation, because one official protects another and higher officials protect them. The profit from the land is taken by all. The king is served by the field. The one who loves silver is never satisfied with silver, and whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with income. This too is futile. As good things increase, the ones who consume them multiply. What then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? The sleep of the worker is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich permits him no sleep. There's a sickening tragedy I've seen under the sun, wealth kept by its owner to his harm. That wealth was lost in a bad venture. So when he fathered a son, he was empty-handed. As he came from his mother's womb, so he will go again. Naked as he came, he will take nothing for his efforts that he can carry in his hands. This too is a sickening tragedy. Exactly as he comes, so he will go. What does one gain who struggles for the wind? What is more, he eats in darkness all his days, with much frustration, sickness, and anger. Here's what I have seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of the life God has given him, because that is his reward. Furthermore, everyone to whom God has given riches and wealth, he also has allowed him to enjoy them, to take his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God, for he does not often consider the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart. Here's a tragedy I've observed under the sun, and it weighs heavily on humanity. God gives a person riches, wealth, and honor, so he lacks nothing of all he desires for himself, but God does not allow him to enjoy them. Instead, a stranger will enjoy them. This is futile and sickening tragedy. A man may father 100 children and live many years. No matter how long he lives, if he's not satisfied by good things and does not even have a proper burial, I say a stillborn child is better off than he. For he comes in futility and goes in darkness. His name is shrouded in darkness. Though a stillborn child does not see the sun and is not conscious, it has more rest than he. And if a person lives 1,000 years twice but does not experience happiness, do not both go to the same place? All of a person's labor is for his stomach, yet the appetite is never satisfied. What advantage does the wise person then have over the fool? What advantage is there for the poor person who knows how to conduct himself before others? Better what the eyes see than the wandering desire. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Whatever exists was given its name long ago, and it is known what mankind is. But he is not able to contend with the one stronger than he. For when there are many words, they increase futility. What is the advantage for mankind? For who knows what is good for anyone in life in the few days of his futile life that he spends like a shadow? Who can tell anyone what will happen after him under the sun? So that's the passage from Ecclesiastes that we're going to look at today, but we're going to spend a lot of time in Paul's writing in Philippians, and we're going to talk about the idea that true contentment will never be found in wealth, honor, or anything else. Trying to find it in any of these things is going to leave us empty. It's going to leave us dissatisfied. Newer and better promises, more promises to make us more complete, but it doesn't give us that. And we find ourselves constantly comparing, constantly dissatisfied. True contentment is only found in Christ, and that's what Paul writes about in Philippians 4. Solomon couldn't find contentment. Paul learned to live a life of contentment. And think about this. He wrote what I'm going to read in a few minutes from prison in Rome, where everything was taken away from him, deprived of basic necessities. Yet he could not have any of that and still find himself content, filled with the joy of the Lord. His contentment was not in his possessions, his activities, his people, his honor, anything else. It's found only in Christ, the one thing that can't be taken away. So what is true contentment? Well, true contentment comes from understanding God's purposes for us. In verse 3 of Philippians 4, it says, I also ask you true partner, to help those women who have contended for the gospel at my side, along with Clement and the rest of my coworkers whose names are in the book of life. When he talks about the book of life, he's talking about salvation, and ultimately that's our purpose, and that's what Jesus went to the cross for. He did for us what we could not do for ourselves. And he desires us to know him, and he desires us to find salvation, and he desires us to make him known. Our purpose is to know him and make him known. Our purpose is to be missionaries. So contentment comes from knowing God's purpose, understanding God's purpose in us. It also comes when we experience God's peace. Verses 6 and 7. Don't worry about anything, but in everything through prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. I learned this as don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God your needs and don't forget to thank him for his answers. We find peace from prayer. We find peace from connecting with God. We find peace when we put the focus on God, not on us. Worry puts the focus on us. Prayer gives us peace as we focus on God. We believe that he's big enough. We believe that he is enough. So talk to him. Talk to him often. Talk to him about anything. Talk to him about everything. He wants to connect with us. He wants to hear joys and sorrows alike. And when he does that, when we do that, he'll guide us, he'll guard us, he'll protect us when we come to him. So it's found in peace with him. True contentment comes when we practice the presence of God. Verse 8, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any moral excellence, anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. These qualities are things that should be found in our lives if we're believers. Whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, morally excellent, praiseworthy, those things. Those are things that we should think on. Those are things we should dwell on. And those are things that come from getting close to God. They come from being in the presence of God. They come from practicing the presence of God. And then we can be the presence of God to those around us. So true contentment comes when we practice the presence of God. True contentment comes in fellowship with God's people. Verse 10 and verse 14. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly because once again you renewed your care for me. You were in fact concerned about me, but lacked the opportunity to show it. Verse 14, still you did well by partnering with me in my hardship. He understood that we're a family. We're a spiritual family. We need each other. When we live in harmony, unity, and community with others, we find contentment in Christ. Paul knew that other people helped him greatly, that's a lot of how he got to where he was through other people, and he appreciated them. And we've talked about this previously in this series, in chapter 4, where he talks about two are better than one. We need each other in this crazy life. We need people on board with us. We need fellowship with God's people. So true contentment comes from that. The fifth thing, and this may be the most important thing of the whole message, true contentment comes regardless of life circumstances. Verse 11 and 12 say, I don't say this out of need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I know both how to make do with little and how to make do with a lot. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or in need. We can find and know contentment regardless of where life takes us. We can find it when we have a little, every bit as much as we have a lot. And that's what Paul's talking about here. Contentment does not come from life circumstances, because life circumstances change, and they change often, but it comes from joy in Christ. So true contentment comes regardless of life circumstances. The next thing, true contentment comes in realizing God's power. Verse 13 is one of the most incredible verses in the Bible, but it's often very misconstrued. It says this in my translation. It says, I am able to do all things through him who strengthens me. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me is how I learned this. A lot of people take that wrong and like, I can do this and this because it says I can do all things through Christ. That's not what it means. We can do everything that we were meant to do. We can do everything that we need to do. We can do everything that we're called to do, but not in our own power and strength, in his. And this is freeing, and this is empowering. And this allows us to take risks, and it allows us to do great things and to do the things that God has called us to do. To know, understand, and experience his power in us, that brings contentment. But we don't do it for ourselves. We do it for him. We do it in his power. We do it in his strength. The last thing, true contentment comes when we trust God's provision. Verse 19, my God will supply all your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. Notice he says needs, not wants, needs. This is a blank check from God, and God's bank will never go bankrupt. He promises to supply all of our needs, not our wants, our needs. And he has plenty of capital for you, for me, for everybody. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, according to Psalm 50:10. 1 Timothy 6:8 says, having food and drink, we are content. Trust that God will meet every need we have and rest in the provision of God. So what does this have to say? What is this all about? How can we wrap this up? Pursue contentment in Christ. Let him be the source of joy, the source of strength. Let him be enough. Let him be sufficient. Our contentment is unconnected to life circumstances. It doesn't increase or decrease based on what we have or don't have or material possessions or anything like that. It's learned as we follow Jesus, which means, of course, we have to be following Jesus. If we have him, if we have his presence, we have enough. And that's the secret to being content. Paul says, I've learned the secret of being content, but it's a secret that's out. It's not a secret like, oh, I can't tell anybody. It's something that we all can have. We can have contentment in Christ because of him.